Could you briefly explain where the topic for this exhibition came from? What is the background of the Trap Island and its flora and fauna?
So the background of the project came from, a few years ago, actually now exactly 2 years ago, I made a project where I started looking at my childhood drawings that I had drawn of birds when I was 4 or 5 years old. And I started to re-examine these drawings. And from this I became interested in birds and ecology and how I related to birds and ecology as a child. And then I started reading a lot of books to sort of acquaint myself with the theory. So I read, first I read this book by an Australian philosopher. The book is called Flightways, and it looks at how birds and people exist in the same world, how birds and people sort of share the same environment. From this, I moved on to other books about the history of theory of evolution and island biogeography, especially island biogeography, so how animals and plants live and exist on islands, and how precarious, how unsure their fate is now during the climate crisis. And then basically the idea for the Chronicles of Trap was born from a desire to experiment with these ideas. So I created or made up a fake island to test these theories that I was reading about that were first put forward by Charles Darwin and other early ecologists. So I made up this island based on other islands in the area, sort of real islands that exist in that place. So islands like South Georgia Island and Tristan da Cunha and Inaccessible Island and Kerguelen, these small cold islands. I wanted the island to be cold and harsh and windy, not a sexy tropical island. It had to be very unassuming. It couldn't have any human inhabitants. It couldn't have any tourist resorts. It had to be purely sort of scientific. And then I proceeded to come up with the flora and fauna for the island based on the rules of island biogeography. So how many animals can exist on an island this small, how they could get there, what would happen to them once they got there. So some birds would lose the ability to fly, some plants, some mosses would become very specialized to certain locations on the island and diverge, become completely different from plants and animals on other islands. And then the island would also have a lot of visitors, so seals, penguins that could swim and fly, and lots of albatrosses and other seabirds. So it started as an experiment to see what I could do with these theories. And then as I continued to read more and more books and research the history of ecology and nature conservation, I started to weave these real stories directly into the Chronicles of Trap. So now the Chronicles of Trap is sort of part fiction, part sort of references to the history of nature conservation. Yeah, that's where it started from.
Do you often use text or other storytelling methods in your works? And how did you get into comics?
I think I often use storytelling in my work. Yeah, my work is very story-based. I'm not interested so much in the formal aspects or the materials or colors or these other things that some artists really go deep into. It's always been the story for me. Previously, I've looked at my own family's refugee history, and now with this project, it's also very sort of it's always based on stories, even if it's not directly always words that I use. Recently I've been trying to move more towards storytelling through objects rather than voiceovers or words or text. And in terms of comics, as a child I didn't read comics. I wasn't one of those kids. Recently I've become more interested in comics as a format for storytelling. I think because it's so unassuming. It's sort of not the way things are done in contemporary art, or it's not full of itself. It doesn't take itself too seriously, and maybe is more accessible for children than it is for adults. I like this approach. I don't know if I have any comic book artists that I would bring out as sort of influences for the Chronicles of Trap, but a few years ago when I was writing my master's thesis, I referred a lot to Art Spiegelman's Mouse as a way of storytelling and telling a serious story through something playful.
You also exhibited this work as part of the Riga Photography Biennale at the Smilga Culture Space in Latvia. Would you explain what you found different in means of exhibiting Chronicles of Trap then and now at Post Gallery?
Yes, at Smilga it was a normal exhibition setting for me. I'm used to thinking in space, as I guess most artists are, but I always try to consider maybe it's because I started off with a sculpture installation background, but I'm always, even if the work is 2D, I always imagine the viewer entering the space and how they see the work, how they're able to see the work in the beginning from a distance, and then they'll be able to approach the work and hopefully walk around the work and relate to the work in space. So in this way, for the Riga Photography Biennial, I felt more at home. And then suddenly when that exhibition was up and I started thinking about the exhibition at Post Gallery, I became slightly panicked because it was a completely different spatial experience. If I'm used to considering the viewer walking around the work, how can I consider the viewer walking around a digital work or an online work? So this, for me, was the main difference between the two exhibitions. I don't know if I'll show Chronicles of Trap again in the same format or a similar format, or if it'll become something else, but I plan to show something along these lines again. And then, I don't know how the post-gallery experience will affect the next showing. But I really like what happened with Chronicles of Trap at Post Gallery, because it took on a completely different spatial sort of a spatial form that I can't help but imagine as a 3D space, even if it's online.
Tell us about your ongoing or future projects.
I'm continuing to work with subjects of ecology, endangered species, extinction, and sort of nature in the Anthropocene, if that's not too pretentious. I don't know if I'll continue to work directly with the Trap comics and the Trap work in an exhibition context. I'd like to, in the coming months, if I get around to it, I would like to try to put together a Trap comic book, like on paper. But I already started in March and April. I started trying to put it into a sort of a paper format, into a book format. But I don't know if what will happen to it if it becomes a book. I think the same as happened with Post Gallery, the project changed based on the format, and I realized I had certain gaps for an online presentation, and I've already understood that the story or the concept has certain gaps if it goes into a book that I need to either fill or change or rework. But yes, in a broader sense, I'm continuing to work with the same subjects, maybe through a slightly more personal approach. I'm working with some textiles that my grandmother designed in the 1980s. They're a selection of textiles that depict Australian animals and plants. Recently I've been sort of remixing them and adding my own designs, adding my own animals into the mix. So the first time I'll show this is in about a month at the Artishock Biennial at the Tallinn Botanical Gardens. And then next year I have a few exhibitions coming up, but I don't know what's going where, and whether the exhibitions will be new work that I can't even imagine at the moment, or if it'll be sort of redesigns of trap or my grandmother's textiles.